Well, hello, quilters, and welcome back. Today, we're going to look at a condensed version of a recent live session. What I've done is taken an hour-long session and I've condensed it. And that live session, if you didn't know, happens every Friday here on YouTube, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have a quilt conversation. And this conversation was about having a machine quilting plan. Do you have a plan? You finish your quilt top, you've read all the directions, and at the bottom of that last step, it says, quilt as desired. You don't need to be afraid of that. If you are, that means you don't have a quilting plan. Have a quilting plan and it's going to help you get your quilts done. There are a couple of different steps that we have when it comes to finishing a quilt top. We need to choose our batting, the backing fabric, our thread and thread color, thread weight. All those steps are separate discussions in and of themselves. But today, and at that live session, we talked about, once we've made those decisions, how do I quilt my quilt top? I have 4 elements, and one is the design. Once I've selected the design, I need to create borders and boundaries. Now that I have borders and boundaries within my quilt that are going to help me feature the design, what direction will I stitch the design? So those 4 things, the selection of the design, creating borders and boundaries that either I use the piecing to create those borders and boundaries or I completely ignore the piecing. And then lastly, once I have those borders and boundaries, how do I stitch my design? What direction? We're going to look at 3 different quilts where I take one free motion quilting pattern and use it in 3 different ways. I hope you enjoy this condensed version. I'll see you at the end of the video, and if you want the full version, just check out the playlist for the Quilt Conversations live. If you have a piece of paper and a pen, write down your process in order, your steps. Once your top is pieced, what is your plan for quilting? What is the next thing you think about? Do you think about batting? Do you think about thread? Do you think about the quilting design? What is your process? Do you have a process? What's the first thing you think about after you finish quilting your quilt top? And you know what? Let's not make it just a quilt top. Anything that you quilt. It could be a bed runner, it could be a small lap quilt, a wall hanging, anything. Does quilting your project produce fear, worry, concern? And if so, what is that worry or concern? We're going to look at how do we choose how to implement that quilting design on your quilt. What are the steps or methods that you can use in making those decisions? And this quilt is called colorway. I'm going to show you how I quilted this one. This was a project for Island Boutique. And if you've taken any of my classes, I've mentioned choosing a design, borders and boundaries, and then direction be the last one. Design, borders and boundaries, borders, boundaries, and then direction. Some designs are directional and some are not. So if you choose a design that's an all-over design, it can have no direction, and so it doesn't look like it's all going in one direction, up or down, left or right. Or it could be a design that has a definite direction, and if so, what direction do you want to quilt in? When you start to think about borders and boundaries to begin your quilting, that will help you segment the areas. And the segmentation can be the piecing of the quilt. In this instance, I didn't use the piecing for my borders and boundaries. I'm going to show you another example where I use this similar technique, but I use the piecing. In this case, the piecing is not considered when I've created the borders and boundaries for the free motion. What I want to show you is this diagram. Pretend this is the quilt, and you have these quilt blocks. The lines, vertical and horizontal, are the seams. And what I'm doing is I'm creating zigzag boundaries for the free motion quilting. So this is the first stage, from corner to corner, making a zigzag. Corner to corner on each block, making a zigzag. Now the next step is to stitch a second zigzag line, and wherever it lands, but you're always going to make the zigzag once you hit the seam. Can you see how that's happening? I've now created borders and boundaries for the free motion quilting. And this you can do easily on a home machine. You can stitch from corner to corner with a walking foot or with a ruler to create those straight lines. Can you see now the zigzag in color wave where I went corner to corner, then did an echo 1 inch away, and now that echo of the zigzag can be as big or as small as you want. It's up to you. But the starting point is always corner to corner, and then you can go above or below that first set of zigzags. So we're going corner to corner, stitching our zigzag, and we can do that with a walking foot or with an acrylic ruler, whichever you choose. And this can be on a quilt, this can be on a bed runner, and guess what? It doesn't have to be corner to corner on a quilt block. It can be even within a quilt block. The whole idea is just creating borders and boundaries. This happens to create the borders and boundaries on a bigger scale. Then we make our second pass, we do an echo, and now we have taken that free motion quilting design and created a space for it to live, a space for it to be appealing and attractive in the quilt. We are just thinking about a method to create borders and boundaries, and it doesn't have to be a zigzag. It can be any other way. Perhaps that zigzag is taking quadrants and doing a bigger zigzag. It doesn't have to be small. It can be 4 blocks that you're making that zigzag on. Now it's direction. I need to know what direction I'm going to stitch the design. Is my design directional? And if it is, do I want to stitch the design going in one direction within the zigzag? Do I want that directional design to come from the edge of the quilt to the center? How do I want to stitch that design? So think about some of your favorite designs. If we were going to do a non-directional design like a meander, it wouldn't matter which way you started your quilting in between those zigzags. You can start on either end and just go until you finish. If it was a feather design, you definitely need to choose what direction you're going to stitch those feathers. But here's the beauty of thinking about design, borders and boundaries. Once you have those borders and boundaries, you can start to think creatively what to put in those spaces. And the design that I chose is Plume Party. I call it Plume Party. It's based on the feather. It's based on the feather design. Instead of the feathers being stacked and connected, they are separated and exaggerated, or they're exaggerated in the opposite direction, either elongated or shortened. The beauty of this, it allows you to move from place to place, and you can add echoes. This is one of the designs in my playlist in my library, so you can find it on the YouTube channel. It's called Plume Party. Notice on this example how the plumes on the lower part of the image, the red, they're almost stacked like a feather, except there's separation. You have this gap in between each plume going left and right, and then echoing to move to the next space. And they're almost the same size. They're closer in size than what you see in the background. You see how in the purple background, the plumes are small and then big and bendy, rather than stacked one on top of the other. So this is the design that I have in colorway behind me, in between those zigzags. Can you see how this design can be both directional and non-directional? Before every quilt, I practice on paper. Then I practice on a small quilt sandwich. Then I go to the quilt. Then I go to the quilt. Then I go to the quilt. Do you practice, and how do you practice? Do you practice with paper and pen, pencil? Do you use a plexiglass? Do you use a whiteboard? How do you practice your free motion quilting? One of my practices in free motion quilting, I'm like a dog on a bone. I'm like a dog on a bone. I'm like a dog on a bone. I find a design that I like and I quilt it in everything. And so we went through bare cloth, where I quilted it in multiple ways in different quilts. I've done the same thing with this, with Plume Party. Don't be afraid of messing up. Practice in your quilts. And if you take one design like I did with Bear Claw and now with Plume Party, I have put Plume Party in everything. And as a result, I have found some variations that I can have a non-directional Plume Party and I can have very directional Plume Party, like you see here in the red one on the lower part of the screen. That's very directional, that plume, whereas behind it, it's not directional. Fantastic. This is a little clip from that video, and I like to demo to show you my movement. And you know I like the open toe foot for visibility, but the main thing is that you get the tools that are going to help you succeed. Whatever tool that you need to succeed, get it. You can hammer a nail with the butt end of a screwdriver, but why do that? Use a hammer. Open toe, my favorite thread. I'm a glove wearer. Some people may not like gloves. They use quilting discs. Use what you need to be successful. Now, I want to show you 2 more quilts that have Plume Party. This is a close-up detail shot of another quilt of mine called Heading Home. The zigzag is in the quilt top pattern. Can you guess which quilt I made first? Heading Home I made before I made Colorway, which is behind me. So when I did Plume Party in Heading Home, I did it directional. I did it in a zigzag fashion because zigzag was already in the piecing. What I did in piecing and then said, hey, I can do a zigzag and make my own with thread, and I did that in Colorway. Learning a skill, applying the skill, and using that skill over and over and over again in various combinations. That's how we get better. Whatever free motion pattern you know right now, keep stitching it in some way. Add a new one. Practice that new one over and over again. Keep adding something new. This is Heading Home. Do you see that zigzag? The zigzag is in the piecing, and Plume Party is stitched the same direction for every zigzag. The quilting, or the direction of the quilting, even though in this case it goes against my advice about not having the eye go off the quilt, this time it is fundamental to the quilt because it's called Heading Home. Geese are flying in that direction. So that's why I quilted in the zigzag, the Plume Party going in the direction that the geese are going home. And where are they going? Geese are heading where when they're going home? Canadian geese, that is. They are heading home, so they are heading right off that quilt. They are leaving Virginia and heading for Canada. Canadian geese. They are flying, and that's why on the geese I use the serpentine ruler to get those wavy lines. It's the wind. They are flying home. So now you've seen Plume Party in two situations being used in a zigzag pattern. We have design, borders, boundaries, and direction. And we've talked a little bit about what direction we're going to stitch based on the theme of the quilt, where you want the visual interest to rest, or if you want the visual interest to come off the quilt. This is crossover. This is where I just filled it in multiple directions with Plume Party. Can you see Plume Party in there? Plume Party is moving along tightly, loose, it's stacked, it's random, it's all throughout that blue rich background. Very dense quilting. Color wave and crossover and heading home. They are PDF downloadable patterns on my website. You go to livingwaterquilter.com, right? Then you scroll down and you look on the right hand side and you see Quilt Patterns, and you click on Quilt Patterns. There we go, Quilt Patterns. They are digital patterns. And there's Color Wave. It's 70 by 90 inches. Full color patterns with diagrams, instructions. This one also has a coloring page. There's Heading Home. It's a smaller lap quilt, 55 by 55 inches. And then there is Crossover, 74 by 90. So I'm so glad you hung around, because I want to know, what do you think? Are you going to use some of those elements that I use to plan my machine quilting? Design selection, creating borders and boundaries, and then how to stitch that design. What direction will that design fill the space? What did you think about the 3 different ways that Plume Party was used? One of my free motion quilting patterns. Plume Party was stitched in Color Wave, Heading Home, and Crossover. All 3 of those quilts are patterns that are available on my website if you'd like to make the quilt. But it's not so much the pattern, but how we can machine quilt the same free motion quilting design differently from one quilt to the next, by using my technique of borders and boundaries, and then ultimately what direction we're going to stitch that pattern within those borders and boundaries. I hope this was helpful, and that you're going to use some of these techniques, and that you will create your own machine quilting plan. You don't have to be afraid of those 3 words, quilt as desired. When you have a plan, that fear goes away. Oh, don't forget, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. There's a share link. Share it on Facebook. Share it in an email with a friend. And I hope to see you at one of the live sessions every Friday right here on YouTube and Facebook, simultaneous. Quilt Conversations, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. See you in the next video, and thanks for watching.